Good evening. On behalf of Texas Folklife, I want to welcome you to our 6th episode of our Folk and Traditional Arts Virtual Roundtable discussion series. And through this series, we're going to use our digital platform to share the stories and culture and creativity we have across the state. And we are so grateful to have our panelists here tonight on the topic of Black gospel music and social justice. We encourage you to participate actively by including your questions and comments in the chat section. So thank you for joining us. These are challenging times, though they're not unfamiliar times. And tonight's topic is particularly relevant in this moment. When hope is under attack, we are reminded of the anthems that were the sounds and spirit of social movements. This is the topic of particular interest to me right now in regard to our organization's history, because in 1987, Texas Folklife produced a Black gospel radio project. It was called Lift Every Voice. It was celebrating 50 years of Texas Black gospel music in Central Texas. And in partnership with the Briscoe Center at UT, we were able to process an archive of 89 audio reels with these recordings of interviews and performances at Black Baptist churches across Austin. As we reflect and challenge the image of our state itself, we need to continue to make these spaces of conversations to recognize Black artists and recognize the bearers of these traditional cultures. And on that note, I'm extremely proud to present tonight's panelists. I'll introduce them in full as we get to each person. But here with us tonight, we have Joseph Middleton, a gospel music historian, Joslyn Henderson, a scholar and singer at Baylor University, and Professor Robert Darden at Baylor University. I'm so grateful to have you all here, and I don't want to take any more time away from tonight's conversation. So I'll introduce in full our first speaker, Joslyn Henderson. She is a full-time graduate at Truett Seminary and Baylor School of Music, having first earned her Bachelor's of Vocal Performance from Spelman College in Atlanta. She's a prolific gospel singer and worship leader. In addition, Joslyn is also an active member of the Waco Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So Joslyn, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. I am Joslyn Henderson. In addition to all of the things that Gabby has already read, I am deeply involved in the study of Black sacred music. I do a lot of writing and reading around it. Most recently, or currently, I'm involved in a book project for Soul Echoes 2, a project where we're looking at hymns from that collection of hymns in 1905 and writing annotations and compiling a book in order for it to come out in the next couple of years or so. I've also been involved in studying particular hymn writers, Charles Albert Tindley being one of them, the one whose work is mainly showcased in Soul Echoes 2, but also hymn writers such as Margaret Pleasant Dureau, Charles Price Jones, Charles Knicks, who some might not even say is a hymn writer, who people would say is more of a gospel songwriter. But yeah, I'm deeply involved in the music of the Black church, and I'm also a member of the Black church, and this is just so innate and natural to me. I'm just blessed and thankful that someone thought of me to be on this panel today, because I sing it, I study it, and I do it. So yeah.
You're welcome to continue. Are you going to tell us a little bit more about your work or your research that you do on the subject? I'd love to know more about your thoughts on Black hymnody and anything else you'd like to share with our audience.
I am actually involved in a Black hymnody webinar series. I did one, the first half of it last week. We're kind of unpacking Black hymnody and racism, kind of looking back at how the Black hymns began, starting with the ring shout and bringing us even further into our contemporary context, and even talking about and connecting to contemporary gospel music artists. So I'm deeply involved in that work. This week, we're speaking specifically about particular Black hymn writers in that seminar. But yeah, my research isn't really specific. I'm not a thesis student. I'm a music ministry student, so I'm mostly involved in doing the work than I am studying it and presenting and researching it. But I am doing doing all types of scholarly work around the Black sacred music space. And I've come to know these two panelists in that space. So in the 2014 Pruitt Symposium on Black Sacred Music at Baylor University, I came to know Joseph Middleton and came to know Professor Darden, both of whom I've kept up a relationship with, and who have connected me to Texas Folklife, which is how I happen to be on this panel today. But yeah, I'm involved heavily in the study and in the praxis of Black sacred music. So yeah, I'm a song leader, a worship leader. I'm a Deborah Carlton Loftus Ambassador for the Hymn Society of the United States and America, for the United States and Canada. I actually got off of a Zoom call earlier where we're planning the 2022 conference. And yeah, that's my work. Yeah.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So I guess I wanted to hear from you on some ideas of Black religious traditions and the expanded ideas of the sacred in Black music, and where it's kind of in this middle ground you spoke about of sacred and secular cultural traditions. Anything you like to talk about of the singing that happens beyond church walls, or any of your work in activism?
Oh, absolutely. So a couple of years ago, I was invited to sing at a March for Our Lives right around when I can't even name the school shooting because there have been so many, but there was a school shooting that happened in the city of Waco, came together to do a rally of sorts. And we met all outside, and I got up and sang "We Shall Overcome," which of course Professor Darden's going to speak into when he talks. But I got up and sang "We Shall Overcome" and added and infused a couple of verses of my own in order to speak into the current time. But after that moment passed, so I was using my voice to be an activist in the moment, an activist and singer and so many other things in that moment. But we walked across the street to go in front of Representative Bill Flores's office, and people were asking me to continue singing. To put this into context for you, it was June 19th. It was Juneteenth that I was at this rally. I sang my song. I went across the street to stand with my Christian brothers and sisters, and the emotional labor was still on me to keep singing, keep performing, when I'm not merely, but I am by all means a participant, in the moment right now. I was performing, and that was my participation while I was on the stage. But while I was in front of that representative's office, I was just there to be there with the people. But it was continually asked of me to sing. So speaking into activism and singing and being in the front like that, sometimes the work can certainly take a toll. So yeah, as much as I'm grateful to have been in that space and to have used my voice the way I did, sometimes it becomes too much. The focus moves and shifts when it maybe shouldn't. I mean, someone asked me to sing Amazing Grace, and I didn't. I did not oblige to that. And another person started singing Jesus Loves the Little Children. And as a woman of color, a Black woman specifically, there needs to be a revision of the lyrics if that's something that we're going to affirm in front of a representative's office, which some people did, but there were people still using red, yellow, black, and white to discuss different races and nationalities and ethnicities. So yeah, so I do a lot of work. I do a lot of social media activism, hashtag activism, but I'm also present and accounted for when there are physical things that I can do and ways that I can show up here in the city. And most of the time I'm using my literal voice, speaking or singing. I think music plays such a great role in activism and bringing people together, even if the overall sentiment doesn't match between all of us. This music can unite us in a way. Yeah.
That's beautiful, the way you talk about it uniting us. It's it seems like for theists and non-theists, this music becomes a sort of a North Star in times, especially in times of adversity. So it's great to hear how you say you had to adapt the lyrics to kind of meet the times, the present times. Are there any other instances you think of where you see the field of gospel music maybe needing to move forward in some areas?
Oh, absolutely. I led worship at the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship General Assembly for 2 years. And I bring my full self to the place. So I'm a gospel singer. If you would ask me, I'd say I'm a gospel singer. I study music, I do music, but I'm a gospel singer, right? So I come into a predominantly white space, and people may expect that I will assimilate or join into a monocultural worship space and experience, but that's not how it is or what it is when I get in there. So one of the songs that we led off with in 2018 was "Oh Give Thanks" by Judy Mcalister. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord. And because of my theological pinings and the way that I see my God, I adapt to those lyrics too. So the original lyrics are for "He is good, yes, He is good," but I use interchangeable pronouns for my God. So I'll say, "For she is good, yes, she is good. For she is worthy, worthy." I'll use whatever, because God cannot be boxed into one gender. A friend of mine, TJ Geiger, Professor Geiger, wears a shirt that says "God is not a man, that he should lie," or da da da. But he just leaves it at "God is not a man," just like period. But yeah, so many times I'm adapting lyrics in order to fit the context, and I know when and where to do it. If I'm going to a traditional Baptist church that's been referring to God as he for the past 150 years, then that's just not an adaptation that's worth making, an argument worth having. But where I know people are further along theologically, that's a shift and a change I'm willing to make in order to fit the context and to fit my own theological framework. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. There's a lot to unpack there. We can come back to some more on that during our discussion. On that note, I'd like to welcome our next panelist up, Robert Darden. Robert Darden is a professor of journalism, public relations, and new media at Baylor University. He is the author of 24 books, most recently "Nothing But Love in God's Water," Volume 2, Black Sacred Music, From Sit-ins to Resurrection City. He is the founder of Black Gospel Music Restoration Project, the world's largest initiative to acquire, digitize, scan, and catalog America's fast-vanishing legacy of gospel music vinyl. This project provides the gospel music for the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. In 2020, Darden was named Baylor's 27th master teacher. He is currently working on a book on Andre Crouch and the disciples. Congratulations on being named master teacher, Professor Darden. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabby. Delighted to be here. Well, I think if I may follow up on Jocelyn's always excellent presentation, the deal is those who can do and those who can't teach, I think. In my case, nor can I sing, nor can I testify, but I can write about those who do. And that's been part of what I've been doing for a long time and tried to save the music. I think the Black Gospel Project's worth a couple minutes, Gabby, if you don't mind here. I had finished a book called People Get Ready, A New History of Black Gospel Music, which remains the definitive book on the topic. But the problem was when I was through with the book, a lot of the songs that I wanted to write about, I couldn't hear. They weren't available, not for love or money. So I sat down in my arrogance and wrote an editorial and sent it to the New York Times, which gets 800 unsolicited editorials a week. And they ran it. And what it said was, if we let this music, the vinyl legacy of the music that changed America from the golden age of gospel music, say 1945, 1980, future generations are going to treat us very, very harshly. And that day it came out, a gentleman called me from New York and said, you figure out how to save it, and I'll pay for it. So I immediately went to the Baylor libraries, because the library and academia is the one place that everybody trusts. We're all very suspicious. We all have our little silo turf. But the library is like Switzerland in the United Nations. Everybody trusts the library. So from Bill Hare to Patty Orr to John Wilson, they sat down with me and put together a dream studio. It would be the finest recording digitization lab in the world. And we sent it to Mr. Royce in New York, and he overnighted us a check. And we built it over the next few years, and it remains the main repository to try to save this music. We now have digitized more gospel music than the Library of Congress, and 60% of what we have, we believe we have the only known copy. And why this fits into this particular topic is that very early, as the hundreds, literally thousands of pieces of vinyl began arriving, we began noticing on the B side, the flip side, and I have to do this for anybody over the age of 40, of a 45, the hit side, and then the B side would not be the hit side, which they would play on the radio. And on these B sides, and I happen to have the Chambers Brothers here, People Get Ready, one of my favorites, would be a song that was related to the civil rights movement, and some very overt songs related to the civil rights movement, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. In 1963, to release a song that on the B-side says, "I believe Martin Luther King was right," or "Ain't no segregation in heaven." And I'm not the brightest guy, but I began to realize when hundreds of these were arriving that this was significant, because it had never been written about. It was not in any of the literature. And I began to see an unbroken line, an apostolic succession from the protest spirituals through the freedom songs right up through today, with music that wasn't meant for everybody to hear. Just like the protest spirituals had two messages, one for the white listeners and one for the black, the other enslaved people. On the B-sides of 45s by obscure and not so obscure gospel artists were messages of hope for other people in the movement. And so that began Nothing But Love in God's Water, volumes 1 and 2, trying to track black sacred protest music from the pre-Civil War right up through today. And what I've been writing about in recent years is how these songs, this protest music, continues to be sung. And yes, obviously in the Black Lives Matter, every time we turn on, God forbid, yet another funeral, these songs are being sung by kids whose grandparents first sang them. But we heard these very same songs sung in the Arab Spring. We heard them in Tiananmen Square the night before the tanks rolled. We heard them in every major justice and social justice and liberation movement for the last 100 years. These songs have been part of the DNA of people earnestly searching for justice and equality ever since. And it's been an inexhaustible mine to kind of find and follow and see what songs continue to be used. And new ones are added. If you were listening last week, you heard Lean on Me, the Bill Withers song sung at the White House. And there have been new songs, but these old ones continue. And I believe they always will continue. And I don't know what my listeners' religious affiliation, if any, is, but the words anointed have been come up because they continue to do what they were designed to do, which was change hearts and transform minds. So Joseph and Jocelyn, you can see I've been listening to a few black preachers in my day over there. So Gabby, that's where I stand right now. And then as the project continues to receive vinyl, we continue to follow different routes with it. Right now, we're working on trying to save the sermons of the civil rights movement. There's not a repository in America doing that, with the exception of a few of Dr. King's at the MLK Library. All of the heroes of the movement who put their life on the line night after night, nobody has bothered to try to save those sermons. So we have moved into that as well. And then finally, on a personal note, as you've mentioned, I've begun kind of my capstone final big gospel project, trying to do the definitive book on Andre Crouch, both the message and the music, because he was one of the very first to write about very specific social justice issues at a time when that nearly got him banned from many churches. And yet he felt like he had to continue doing that, and did right up until the end. And that brings you up to date. So any questions related to that?
Thank you. There's definitely a lot to unpack there, and I'm sure we'll have more questions as we get more into our discussion, but I'm so glad you're doing the work to preserve these important vinyl pieces and other recordings. That's so wonderful. On that note, we can move on to our next panelist, and I would like to welcome Joseph Middleton. He is a self-taught gospel music historian from Houston, Texas. Joseph took an interest in the golden era of gospel music, so 1945 to 1965, after hearing it in his childhood. He currently works in the public sector, but still researches and listens to vintage gospel music as a hobby. Musically, he is a member of the Houston Ebony Opera Guild Chorus, which includes spirituals and hymns in its repertoire, which are exactly the roots of gospel music. On that note, Joseph, please join us, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I want to thank Jaime Puente for throwing my name out there so you could have me out here on this panel with y'all. And also I want to say hi to Jocelyn and Dr. Darden here among some heavy hitters. So, you know, I don't know how I'm going to compete with those two, what they just came up with. I'm just sitting here like, oh, how do I compete with that? So I'm just gonna try, do my best and see what we can do. But I'll go ahead and start off with how I got interested in gospel music. Of course, you know, being Black and coming up in the Black church, I heard the music all the time. Very much part of my soundtrack then as it is now. But it was my father who was listening to the gospel music that he grew up with, which was, as you said, the golden era of gospel music, 1945 to 1965, roughly. And we would go on trips and he would put in his CDs and I would hear the Blind Boys, the Staple Singers, and Bells of Joy from Austin and so many other groups. And he exposed me to this at a young age. And so that was pretty much my doorway into vintage gospel music. And so as time went on and technology improved, I met others online when I was at the time late teens, early 20s, who were also interested in this music. And I found a lot of them through social media and on YouTube, where I met people like Dwayne Roaches Lightsey, Timothy Howard Williams. A lot of them back in the late aughts had channels, and they posted this vintage gospel music, and I was among one of them. And so we have kind of built this community since then, and we still, you know, talk about releases that are coming up. Like a lot of this older music is now being found on streaming platforms. The Malico catalog has released a lot of old Savoy music now on Spotify and Apple, iTunes, and that's just been one thing that we've really discussed, that it looks like people are starting to have a renewed interest in this music, and especially in this current climate as it is now, this racial climate. As we all know, a lot of these protest songs from the days of the civil rights movement had their roots in gospel music. They were basically gospel songs that were turned around and repurposed, let's see, of course I would start to draw a blank right now, but you know, songs like Freedom, what's the name of that song? See, okay, you can give me
Amen begins in that. This little light of mine has its roots in some gospel.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, through the years, I guess, you know, you sing it so much that, you know, I'll overcome someday, we shall overcome. When you sing the song so much, it just kind of become part of your background, your soundtrack. And so, you know, it's just so many songs that from the church have been put into the movement, since that is where the movement came from. But this music from the golden era of gospel especially found a place in the movement. You had people like Dorothy Love Coates from Alabama with the Gospel Harmonettes. I've heard stories that she was willing to march and go to jail for the cause. Then you had people like Roberta Martin of Chicago. She actually hosted Dr. King in her home a couple of times when he would come to Chicago to speak. And then I know here in Houston back in the 60s, Mahalia Jackson, I believe, used to come down here and she used to sing for the cause. And so a lot of these gospel artists from back then, well, I guess it's like Fannie Lou Hamer said, if you're born black, you're born in a mess. They didn't have any choice but to be involved in it. And so it's just very strong. And I believe that with the current movement as it is going now, some people are reaching back, as Dorothy Norwood would say, go down old school boulevard to get some of these songs that have this power about them. And the people who are Christian or non-religious, they feel emotions from these songs. And so this music has a power to it that maybe no other genre has. And so I believe that's part of the reason why I was so attached to it and growing up. And as time progressed, I also had a blog. It's still up. It's called the Golden Era Gospel Blog that I maintained for a couple of years. I probably haven't posted anything to it in close to 10 years or so, but the information is still up there, information that I had researched over the years. And from what I hear, it still remains as a resource to a lot of people doing this research. And so I'm glad about that. And so, like I said, I still listen to the music. I it's in my blood. I can't get it out of my blood. So it's just part of my life, and I enjoy it so very much. And as you know, as they mentioned, the Truett Symposium, it was back in 2014 where I met Joslyn and Dr. Darden when another friend of mine, Bob Mirovich from Chicago, came down to speak. And so, I've just made an amazing network of people through this love of this music. And I'm just, excited to see what places they'll go to after this lockdown lets up and we can get out there and start having more symposiums. And I think perhaps most importantly, performing the music, because as you very well know, this music isn't being performed much in our churches anymore. And so we're having to rely on these recordings, but I think there's just something about a live performance that a recording can't touch. And so I believe that once all this lets up, we can get back into performing and doing symposiums. I think awareness of Black gospel music, especially from the golden era and the hymns and anthems, I think is just going to grow.
Thank you, Joseph. No, it's really important to hear all that background and history, and you're definitely among the heavy hitters. So consider yourself, one of the leaders on the topic. I did look at your blog. It's extensive. The wonderful ethnography and research you have in traveling Texas to talk to people is fascinating. So I'd be curious to hear if there were any anecdotes or particular interviews you had that stood out to you during your time in writing that blog.
Well, one of the things that I did, it was about 10 years ago. I was attending Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Houston at the time, and they brought in Sarah Jordan Powell to sing during, I believe it was Grandparents' Day. And so I took that opportunity to talk with her and interview her, and she's one of the nicest people that I'd ever met. Her background goes back into the golden era. She sang with Sally Martin Singers at one point out of Chicago, and I think it was the late 60s or early 70s, she might have had some material put out there produced by the late James Cleveland. And so she's had a long-standing presence in gospel music, but she was so kind and let me sit down and talk with her and ask her as many questions as I wanted to. And that was just one of the nicest experiences that I've had in interviewing. And I've also had other great experiences. I've been to Chicago a couple of times. The last time I was in Chicago was back in 2017. My friend, the late Ronald Greer of Bay City, Texas, he was a biographer and he had written a book about the Roberta Martin singers. And he had been doing this research for over 30 years. He interviewed the singers when they were still alive. He traveled to Chicago to get material for his book, photographs, and all sorts of things. And he was one of the key figures in helping to get the group inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. And that was really big because they had been founded over 80 years ago, and they hadn't had such a recognition before. And that's particularly important when you consider that a lot of people, gospel music historians, consider Roberta Martin to be the bedrock of Black gospel music. She was one of the first people to put together a mixed aggregation of singers. I guess you can kind of say a precursor to today's praise team. She was doing that back in the 30s when people were getting away from a lot of the Jubilee type music. She was bringing in the gospel sound. And so she was one of the trailblazers. And being in Chicago when they had a concert to commemorate their being inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame, it was amazing. Dr. Bobby Jones was on hand, Dorothy Norwood, the Barrett sisters, and probably what was one of their last performances with Billy and Rhodessa. They also had, did I mention Dorothy Norwood? I think I did. She was there. And it was just a wonderful time, and one of the experiences that I'll never forget. And just bringing everything together and experiences, bringing people with like minds together. It was a very positive experience, and I'll never forget that.
Thank you for sharing that. There's a lot of good research there and a lot of great experiences to share. There's so much to unpack here, and I kind of like to open up, the conversation amongst all of us. And I'm glad you mentioned, Joseph, that you mentioned the Bells of Joy from Austin, Texas. They were one of the groups that we recorded back for the 80s in the radio project, excuse me. And I was doing some research when I was poking around what artists they had spoken to in those interviews, and AC and Esther Littlefield of the Bells of Joy were one of the big participants in that project. And now their legacy is carried on by their nephew, Willis Littlefield, who still lives in Austin. And just a little tidbit trivia, around Christmas time, Mr. Littlefield's house is quite the tourist hotspot. Apparently, he decorates the front lawn with all sorts of Christmas characters that dance. And I'll have to go visit. They say he really appreciates when people go and drop off some batteries and listen to the music with them. So I'm glad you mentioned them. But more on this topic of Black gospel music and its importance to this time and people resonating with this music. And like you mentioned, the idea of the way the emotions just hit you in this music, unlike any other genre. It's a term, we talk about as collective effervescence, the chills, the frisson you get when you hear this kind of music. So if any of you would like to chime in, I'd like to, to kind of expand on this idea of how it does just permeate people's emotions and how that can help, how do we say, invigorate and inspire change during these challenging times.
I just assume Jocelyn go first since she's actually does it, but since she had to go first to begin with, I'll set her up on this. There's a couple things happening here that have made, as Joseph and Jocelyn have said, why this thing has this kind of power and why it has this kind of sustaining power, and why this song and not that song, and why this genre and not that genre, and why Black music maintains its place at the center of all American popular music, because you can trace everything pretty much from the music of Africa. The 8 distinctives of African music are still to be heard today, whether you're listening to rap or jazz or rock and roll. And if you watch Ken Burns' series on country music, you see that Black music was at the heart of so much of what we now call country music and what hat music is getting away from as it turns more pop. What I want to add to that before Jocelyn talks about actually doing it and feeling the spirit come through, because as you can see in Old German, we don't get to do a lot of that sort of thing, is that this music has a history to it that most of the people who sing it know. They may not know the particulars, but they know that their grandparents sang "We Shall Overcome," and their grandparents' grandparents sang it. And they sang it for virtually the same reason, with often the same result, that it empowered them when they were down, it chilled them out a bit when they were too up, it educated, it inspired, and it sustained. And it only can do that if it has this deep well of shared emotion, that it has the kind of resonance that crosses generations. And I love rock and roll, and I love just about any kind of music. And there is a history in rock and roll, but it ain't a 400-year history. And there is a history in classical music, but it isn't a history that's rooted in slavery. It isn't rooted in pain, and it isn't rooted in the kind of search for justice and search for freedom. All of the other forms of music are wonderful, but only Black music in this way. Now, there's other folk musics and other cultures, but of the musics that have sustained and have been the foundation for all popular American music, Black music is at the core. And when you add the centrality of the church and the music of the spirit there, then you're something altogether different. I've been, as I was gospel music editor for Billboard for 15 years, so I've seen a lot of concerts, black and white. And I have seen, and you have seen, country acts and rock and roll acts who have just gone through the paces, who have just done their gig and left. But if you believe you're singing for the Lord and you believe that the Holy Spirit is there, you're going to give the same performance for 10,000 people that you gave for 1,000 that you gave the night before for 10 people in a storefront church. And I know this is true because I've seen Jocelyn do it, and because I've been to so many places where the Black singer who came from this ethos, who have this deep well in their DNA of knowing, I'm not just singing for me, I'm singing for those who came before, and I'm singing because the Holy Spirit has mandated this. I could make more money singing rhythm and blues. I could make more money singing backup for Kanye West, but I feel called to do this. And if I feel called to do it, I have to do it to the best of my ability. I have yet to see a gospel artist phone it in. And that part, that authenticity and that passion is something that I treasure as a music historian. And I don't want to see somebody just mail it in, knowing they're going to get a check at the end of the night. First off, a lot of gospel artists didn't know if there was a check at the end. And secondly, it's because you're doing it because you're called to do it. And I'm going to self-mute and let Jocelyn respond.
So when you talk about this transcendent power of music, that it goes to the people, I'm thinking specifically about the Alleluia Conference in 2017, where Dr. Abington came and we did this night of Black sacred music. And Dr. Abington was talking about Precious Lord, and I don't have to retell the story, because I mean, if there's a story to be known in Black gospel music, it's the story of Precious Lord, right? So it was to set this in a historical context. It was 2017, July of 2017. It was the summer. I had just quit. Resigned from a church that previous fall, in September of the fall before, because there was some really high racial tension at that church that I could not stay in. So I left that church. I was right at the end of my, I have been without a job. I've been out of a church, and here comes Dr. Abington, and he's like, hey, why don't you sing Precious Lord in this service? So I began singing. I'm like, let me sing the song because I know the song. But when you get to, I'm tired, I'm weak, Lord knows I'm worn. That's personal for me because I'm tired. I'm weak, I'm worn. I'm tired of saying Black Lives Matter and getting a text message. I'm tired of hollering and screaming and trying to affirm my own humanity and womanhood and people saying that that's too loud. I'm tired of being castigated at a place where only my singing voice is heard, but my speaking voice cannot be heard. So when we come into these places and when we sing and when we express this music this way, it's because it has pricked our hearts. The gospel singer, it has gone to the person, and only because it's gone to the person can it minister and touch and reach those who are out in the audience. I mean, it's an otherworldly, like, it's indescribable to even talk about it. It's one of those things you have to experience. Even so, you know, we talked about the dichotomy of sacred and secular right at the beginning. And last week in the webinar that I did, I talked about how black music generally falls in this overlap of a Venn diagram, per se, of sacred and secular, in that you could listen to Fantasia sing anything and feel the Holy Spirit moving to and through her, and she's singing about a man who left. I mean, something as simple as that, but it's a lived experience that's being expressed that is universal, that every person can relate to. Who was that? Someone recently, I can't remember who it was, talked about speaking to the pain. Oh, it was Babyface on the like verses that happens on Instagram. He was talking about how Mary J. Blige was just this young girl, and that she was gonna be singing Not Gonna Cry, like, I was your lover and your secretary, working every day of the week. I was a child when Waiting to Exhale came out. I was a child when I heard that music, but I was truly convinced that Mary J. Blige was the lover and the secretary working every day of the week, because it's such a personal, the way that we express our music, Black music, is such a personal expression that you can't help but sit in that place like, ooh, man, like, ooh, she's really not gonna cry no more. Like, ooh, she's really tired, weak, and worn. Woo, like, the Lord really needs to lead me and guide me along the way. Woo, I feel the Holy Spirit. There is a sweet, sweet spirit in this place. Like, it, you know, it can relate so many places and in so many ways. I'm just grateful that God uses me to spread God's gospel all across wherever I'm doing it. Just I'm grateful because it comes to me and it ministers to me, and then it goes out to the people. So thanks be unto God for that, and for people who see the gift and the anointing and the talent and say, we want a piece of that, or not a piece of that. We want that to be shown. We want that to be elevated. We want that to be amplified. Yeah.
I'm glad you gave some context to the historical perspective, you know, the way Black music emerges from the stories of the people behind it. You speaking and singing from your own experience is really personal. And that's definitely, you know, the reason why it's so moving to hear these musicians singing. We have a question from someone watching in Dallas, Lawrence Mann. He says, Detroit was considered the capital of gospel music in the 1980s. How did Thomas Whitfield, Donald Vallis, and the Clark sisters and Fred Hammond from Detroit revolutionize gospel music? If any of you want to chime in on this.
I'm jumping in to say I'm from Chicago, so my perspective is different. But I'll defer to Professor Darden, who is the scholar in Black gospel music. Professor.
I get out of my area of expertise when we get into the 90s. I'm pretty much just the old stuff. I know Atlanta still outsells all the other markets for gospel, but that doesn't make it necessarily the heart of gospel. Whitfield and the Winans and the group certainly made Detroit a hub. But for what has been the center of gospel music since that time, I don't know. I do know that from Yolanda Adams in Houston to Kirk Franklin in Dallas, Texas is not doing so bad. I'm going to turn it over to the young people and answer that one. That's past my expertise. So, Joseph, I'm going to mute.
Okay. Well, as he asked, how did Thomas Whitfield, Donald Wells, Clark Sisters, and Fred Hammond, how did they revolutionize gospel music? Well, I guess you can say they were the generation after the generation I did a lot of my study on, but there is still a generation of gospel music that I do listen to. I know for a fact, Thomas Whitfield, he got his start playing piano for a lot of the older groups. There's a video on YouTube of him playing for the Davis Sisters in the late 60s on, it was either TV Gospel Time or Jubilee Showcase. But, he's more known for his work with the Whitfield Singers in the 80s. And one of his biggest, most popularly known songs, I would say, is Soon as I Get Home. Others might know it better as I Shall Wear a Crown. And as a matter of fact, they sang that song at George Floyd's funeral a few weeks ago. So that song and Maestro Whitfield, as they call him, still very much a part of the Black Gospel Songbook repertoire. And so that's just one way that Thomas Whitfield changed or made his mark in the field of gospel music. Donald Wells, he was very prolific writer, singer, somebody who, like a lot of gospel artists, we lost too early. But, he sang, performed on so many songs. I will admit, I'm not really as acquainted with him as I am with some of the others. Clark Sisters, now that goes without saying, they've been out there for about 50 years and still going strong, just had a Lifetime movie. That alone will be enough to tell you that they've made their mark, because I cannot think of any other Black gospel music singer or group that has had a Lifetime movie. So that should go ahead and tell you enough of how big their impact is. And they're still going strong today too. And as Fred Hammond, I know a bit about him, his work with Commission. He's still going strong as a solo artist. He's probably crossing the line into the legend category now as time goes on. He might get mad if he hears me saying that, but it's the truth. A lot of people look to him now as I guess you could say as one of the old heads, as they like to say. But I think that a lot of people from Detroit have made their mark on history. Also, can't forget Vanessa Bell Armstrong, also from Detroit, another singer who has made her mark. But I would say as the attention did drift from Chicago in the 70s, it started to concentrate more on Detroit in the 80s. And that's more of my friend Marcel West, more of his thing, because he's from Detroit. He's put on a big Detroit gospel project. He can talk about this more than I can. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone, because I don't know too much more about gospel.
And I'll just add some other names into the gospel Detroit bag. Reverend Charles Knicks and the St. James Adult Choir is another big group that came out of Detroit in the 80s. I think it's fair to say that Chicago was a cultural center for gospel music when it began, and then it moves and took up residence in Detroit for some time. I would defer to that and say that too. But yeah, Charles Knicks being there and Thomas Whitfield. For more about Thomas Whitfield, please reach out to a good friend of mine, Dr. Brandon Waddles. He just finished his PhD studying and writing about Thomas Whitfield, and that is his area of expertise by all means. But yeah, he anytime we talk about a contemporary artist of today, Thomas Whitfield comes into the conversation. For instance, Ricky Dillard's newest album, Choir Master, one of the best songs on the album, which is not saying much because I enjoy the entire album, but one of Ricky Dillard's songs, Let There Be Peace on Earth, at the end it goes into a vamp that says, peace, 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 oh, peace. And Brandon hit me up and he said, you know where he got this from, right? And I was like, James Cleveland. And Brandon was like, no. Try again. I don't even know why I didn't just immediately go with Thomas Whitfield, knowing who Brandon is. But yeah, so Thomas Whitfield's music is still absolutely like influencing today's culture of Black gospel music. So absolutely, I would agree that Lawrence Mann, I would agree with Lawrence Mann that Detroit was a cultural center for Black gospel music in the 80s. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm glad you gave us some listening homework. We'll have to check out that album. Joseph, I'm glad you brought up George Floyd's funeral, bringing it back here to Texas. That was, one of the largest Southern Baptist churches there, a huge gathering with some of the gospel greats, Kim Burrell, Kurt Carr, and the service began with a song by Andre Crouch, This Blood Will Never Lose Its Power. And I was wondering, Professor Darden, if you wouldn't mind speaking to the mix of music that we heard from that service. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm afraid all I heard was about the funeral and the blood will never lose its power, but you're into my sweet spot right now. I think it's hard to overestimate the power of Andre Crouch, who in many ways begins what we kind of consider now praise and worship music, certainly as it's seen in an African-American community. He has that direct connection from the Kojic and Mattie Moss Clark, who helps discover him and who brings the mass choirs back along with James Cleveland and a lot of the contemporary sounds that we now went from the Winans to Ty Tribbett and on can all find, and they all cite Andre Crouch. If there is a Mount Rushmore of gospel music, in my mind, it would be Mahalia Jackson, Thomas Dorsey, James Cleveland, and Andre Crouch. If there's a fifth one, it's probably Roberta Martin. So it's hard to argue on that. I'm fascinated, and why I've followed this particular research, part of it is there's still people alive who worked with him and knew him. His twin sister, Sandra, still pastors their church and is considered the greatest tambourine player in history, who has played on more hit albums tambourine than anybody alive, and has flown across the country to play tambourine, if you can believe that, even today. And many of the musicians that first played with him have gone on to be the foundation of so many gospel artists. But what frustrates me, and what Joseph and Jocelyn have experienced firsthand, is you're writing about this once-in-a-generation transitional, transformative artist, and there's one small thesis, one small dissertation, and no books. There's virtually no articles. He doesn't do many interviews. It wasn't that he wouldn't, it was that at the time, nobody was much interested. We have no major interviews with Roberta Martin. We have one extensive film clip with Thomas Dorsey, one with Sally Martin. We have more on Mahalia Jackson than anybody else, and it doesn't fill a small folder. We just don't have much information, and the people who were there and who saw and hear it, were losing them every day. And when I did the book on the music of the civil rights movement, people that I would set up interviews with, by the time I got up to see them 6 weeks later, I would have lost another one. And yet we could have all of these people interviewed and saved, and their messages, which are essential and timeless and important, right now, if we realize the power of what we're losing and we're not doing it. So if I would say that about Andre, if you've got connections, if you know somebody who worked with Andre, I want to hear about it, because we're going to put something together before it's too late.
Oh yeah, and I'll speak even to that as well. I was doing an independent study course with my professors at Baylor, Dr. Maxiel and Dr. Monique Ingalls. And I was writing about Charles Tinley, C.P. Jones, and Reverend Charles Knicks. And I started to search the internet for information about Charles Knicks, and it was few and far between. And Joseph mentioning Marcel West, he was one of the people I was going to reach out to about the project, about the writing, the paper and everything. But I mean, there's just not enough scholarship. And there are contemporary folks who are going to school and studying and writing these things, but certainly not enough to make, you know, to make life's work of it. Yeah, like not enough in comparison to any other, you know, American musical artist or something like that. But yeah, so there's a need for people to jump in and to take on those research roles. I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
We know every blues artist, every song they recorded, every alternate take. We have people devoted for 100 years to the study of rock and roll. We have entire institutes to rap. We have more music on classical music. We know more about Beethoven and Mozart than we know about Thomas Dorsey and Mahalia Jackson, who changed America.
I agree. I want to jump in real quick and say, with those genres of music that you just mentioned, as much as gospel has been a part of this country, you would think that somebody like Ken Burns or somebody of that caliber would have made a multi-part documentary about music. But I guess maybe there's just not enough interview material out there, because, I mean, the heritage and the history of this music is just as rich as any other genre. Blues, jazz, R&B, rap, everything. It comes from gospel just about. And so you would think that we would have that, you know, something like that out there, but it's just unfortunate that we don't.
And I think that's, I was jumping into, but I think that's why it was so significant to see the Clark Sisters movie on this national platform or international platform for folks, you know, across this pond that are watching Lifetime. That's why it was such a big deal for us as, you know, gospel artists, gospel singers, church kids, so many ways that we could relate to this story. But yeah, so yeah, completely agree with what everyone has said before me.
Henry Louis Gates has a series coming out this fall on the PBS called The Black Church in America, which we contributed to at the Black Gospel Project. And it is the first multi-part series on the history of Black music within the church in the year 2021.
It's important that we grapple with the importance of preserving these songs and preserving these narratives. I think, you know, moving forward so that people who are involved in these movements have anthems. And I guess to that point, I wanted to ask if any of you would like to speak on how gospel music can continue to promote restorative justice in society and provide hope, you know, in these times. And are there any songs that have emerged at this time, whether they're old school songs or contemporary songs, as anthems in the current movement?
Well, I was going to jump in. I just remembered a Mahalia Jackson quote about gospel music as compared to the blues. As you know, she was courted by many to jump the line and sing secular music, but every time she would refuse. The closest she came was partnering up with Duke Ellington on, let's see, Come Sunday. I was getting confused with Daryl Coley, When Sunday Comes. But that was the closest she came. But it was Mahalia. She said that gospel gives you hope. And when you sing it, you have hope. When you sing the blues, you still have the blues at the end. Now, some blues songs, you may not have the blues at the end, but maybe back then it was a little bit different. But when you say that, gospel music, it gives you hope for the future, and it gives you strength to keep on fighting. And, you know, as far as songs that might be used in the movement now, I think that's more, that's something that Jocelyn could probably speak better to than I can. I'll what do you say?
I think there are so many. There are maybe more quotes or lines from songs that are that are applicable to the moment than a full song. Of course, "We Shall Overcome" is still an anthem song in 2020. But yes, there's I'm gonna speak into the contemporary because that's where I am, right? So Trey Songz just came out with a song maybe 3 weeks ago or so. It's called "How Many." It's like 2020 riots. How many? And he's singing in the song. He's like, "How many more? Sons, how many more?" Like basically saying, how many more times are we going to have to do this? Like, how many times are we going to have to do this? Matter of fact, let me pull it up. I think I can read the lyrics on my phone. How many mothers have to cry? How many brothers gotta die? How many more times? How many more times? How many more marches? How many more signs? How many more lives? How many times? And I think it's a contemporary version of what's going on. I mean, it's a beautiful song. One of my Spelman sisters is doing background vocals for it. So, I mean, I listen to it for that reason. But I do think it's a really good like glimpse and lens into our context. I don't think people are going to be singing it out in the streets, but I think it's a good song to listen to like get amped up for on the way to the protests and to the marches. But yeah, I think "We Shall Overcome" is just the one that's predominant in my mind. I see your mic is off, Professor Darden, so you're about to say something. So, yeah, that's what I'm thinking of right now. That comes to my mind first.
What I don't hear enough is "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." So I'm hearing a lot more people trying to turn them around now that I have in a long time. I'd love to see a little more of that one come back. And "Oh, freedom, freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. Oh, freedom, freedom come over me." And what I'd like to hear more, I know we're running out of time, is an old Kojic song. It's not really a song, but it's a chant. It's "I'm a soldier. I'm a soldier in the army. I'm a soldier." Because that's what it's going to take. You got to keep marching. We've got to keep marching. Till at least November.
Yeah. Yes, amen, somebody. That was the song that got the changed lyrics. So "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around" when I did it on Juneteenth, those years ago. But it was "Ain't Gonna Let Counter Protesters," because I mean we were there, marching and protesting against gun violence in schools, these school shootings, and there were people literally at the protest with guns.
I saw.
Like we got our guns blazing. I'm like, "Ain't gonna let counter protesters turn me around. Gonna keep on a walking, keep on a talking, walking up to freedom land." Like we can't do it. We just, yep.
I don't know that we can top that, Gaby.
That was perfect. That was perfect. We do have a quick comment from someone on Facebook. TJ says, "If the first person interviews and writings aren't available, what are other sources folks might search for and draw on to tell the stories of gospel singers, like church programs and archives, school records, local newspapers?"
Well, you can always go to the Black Gospel Music Project at Baylor University. Every song we have, you can listen to free streaming. You can certainly hear the music of the movement. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 14,000 items digitized at this point. And I'll be immodest here, but Nothing But Love in God's Water, Volumes 1 and 2, Black Sacred Music from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement. It was the first attempt to try to quantify and trace the music specifically site by site along the Freedom Trail right up through today. So if you don't mind me a free shameless plug, it is by University Press, so I'm not going to ever make any money out of it. So
I'm gonna add a +1 to that. Yes, go get Nothing But Love in God's Water. Absolutely. Yes.
This has been so wonderful, and I'm sure we could talk all night on this topic. It is so dense and rich and moving and timely. I just want to open it up if there's anything else you guys would like to speak to. Otherwise, if there is a song that you would like to leave us with for our audience, we'd really appreciate that.
Thank you much.
What's the song? Professor Darden, you got to give us the song. Have we already sung it? She said we should end, maybe we should end with the song.
Oh, okay. As long as I can mute before we sing.
What's a good song for today? I mean, we've named the big two. Oh, I'm a soldier. Well,
I'm a soldier. Can you do it? It's only got 2 lines.
I was thinking in the army of the Lord, but I don't think that's the same song you're thinking of. Let's see. Are the comments saying anything?
Amen. This little light of mine. Amen.
Amen. This little light of mine. Okay. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Oh, everywhere I go, oh, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All on the internet, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, all over your Facebook, I'm gonna let it shine. Down your Twitter feed, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. I'm gonna go back to the first one. Oh, everybody, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Thank you all of you for joining us. This has been such a wonderful evening and wonderful discussion, and that song was just the icing on the cake. So thank you so much for sharing your time, talents, and I really think we could use a part 2 of this conversation. It was so great. I want to thank each of you for being here, and thank you to everyone watching at home. Everyone, please follow Texas Folklife Facebook page to keep up with these great conversations we'll keep having virtually at these times, and stay tuned for future programs. We're especially grateful to Humanities Texas, the City of Austin Cultural Arts Division, and the Texas Commission for the Arts for helping us put on these programs. And I wanted to leave us with the words of Maya Angelou and say that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And so on that, together in hope and through hope, let's work toward a beautiful world. And on behalf of Texas Folklife, I'm Gabriela Kane, and many thanks.